All right, let's dive in, John. Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right.
So to begin with, Applerouth, who we are, our why, the reason we do what we do for the past 21 years, that when you change a student's beliefs about themselves, their abilities, their competencies, you change their performance, you change their lives. So a lot of our work at Applerouth is helping kids shift their perceptions or thinkings about themselves as students. There's always a piece from the very beginning. Things that we do three things. We do academic tutoring, we do test preparation, and we coach kids on executive functioning, how to be more organized, more together. Both John and I, we are very involved with these pieces. All right, next slide. So our goals for today, we have 4 goals for today, talking about testing and assessments, having to show up and take a test in chemistry and in physics and an AP exam, an SAT exam, a college midterm, a college final, how they work, how to prepare for them, different strategies that are going to be effective for different kinds of assessments, definitely different ways of preparing based on it's an essay format, a short answer. There are different things that we understand, what kind of studying, what kind of tools and skills do you need. We'll talk about different strategies, and then we'll talk about the day of testing to make sure you go in there to hit your optimal score and you're really prepped and primed for your best outcome on testing. All right.
Yeah.
So assessments, they are part and parcel of education. There's, it's interesting watching America getting more into them, then less into them, and are we overdoing it? And then there's No Child Left Behind. And one of the things that we look at them for is feedback. Feedback, how we're doing, what do we actually learn? So feedback for the teacher, feedback for the student, as well as, if you saw my earlier talk, when you take a test, something happens in your brain. And the content that you have to forcibly recall and retrieve from long-term memory gets locked in more deeply by the act of you trying to retrieve it without recall, without supports or scaffolds. So if you get tested on something, it sticks longer in your brain. That's one of the coolest things, which is why self-testing is really important before the actual official test. So learning and retention happen when you're doing testing of yourself. And so honestly, there's a lot of research out there that testing is one of the most powerful learning tools that we have available. We have ample research that if you want to really learn something and really retain it for long term, when you have to forcibly test yourself and retrieve from memory and recall information, even if you get it right or wrong, the act of trying to pull it up locks that memory deeper into long-term memory. That's pretty cool. All right, next slide. So it's when you force yourself to retrieve information, you get great feedback. Do I actually know the material? So many kids, when they're doing review for a test, they're getting ready for a midterm. I know many kids over the years who they just read my notes, or they go through or they'll read the chapter. Some of them let's read the chapter 3 times. The challenge with that is when you're doing anything that passive and you're not creating any errors, you're not getting feedback to actually know it, because anyone can just read through something, but you're not sure did my mind actually encode it in a way that I can pull it back later. Of course, I can repeat the words, read the words, but there's no guarantee that that's sticking, that I actually am learning it. So one of the best things to do is to force yourself to retrieve the material, ask questions. Do I know this? Test yourself, check yourself. One round of testing is worth probably 2 rounds or 3 rounds of rereading. And so because again, it alters the encoding. Every time you're pulling things forward, it changes the weight of the synapses and makes them more durable. You actually are shifting your brain by doing self-testing. Next slide. Now, when it comes to assessments, we have worked with students over the years. Some of them like tests. Their kids, the proverbial, I'm a good test taker. And then the proverbial, people who they don't like tests. They perceive that I'm not good at tests. And when you work with students who bring that belief that I'm not a good test taker, we have to work through that, because that becomes a pretty meaningful impediment to performance, to progress. And just that thought alone can undo dozens of hours of work and study if you believe I'm not, when it comes to testing, I don't do well. So even irrespective of how you've done in the past, that belief is a thing. That belief can block performance. And we have to shift that mindset. And John and I both like to poke holes when a kid comes and says, I'm not good at blank. It's our job as tutors to begin poking holes, looking for disconfirmatory evidence. Has there ever been a time ever where you did okay on blank? And is it every time without exception ever, going back for eternity, you're always bad at this? Or let's examine the context. Were you prepared? How, what was your rapport with the teacher? Did you have good rest? All these things, and looking for any time ever there was something contradictory to that statement. So we want to find a way for you to believe that there is the possibility that you could do better on this test on this day. Or do you believe that there's no chance that whatever I do, I'm going to have a bad outcome? And that's the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And we understand that the brain is changing constantly. Until you die, you are developing new synapses, new connections, and neurons are wiring to different places. Learning is happening all the way up. It's happening more rapidly in your youth, but even in your 60s and 70s, and new neurons things are moving around and reconnecting. So neurogenesis, it's real. The brain is very plastic. So if you don't believe that the brain can change and grow, and then you're not following what actually we know about the brain. So a growth mindset is a more honest understanding of how the brain works, and to make sure kids don't lock into I just am bad at blank, because that only if you want to be, and only if you are committed to that belief, in which case that's going to be a major issue for any kind of progress. All right, next slide. All right, how do you prepare for the tests? So there are a number of things, the way the brain works. The brain likes things in a structured way. The brain likes things being reduced to small bits and pieces. We have, the rule of memory. It's, 7 things is the average. It's 7, plus or minus, 2. From 5 to 9 is the average thing. One of the reasons our phone numbers are, broken out in little bits, and it's easier to remember things in little chunks. So security numbers, phone numbers, with, versus if I had you, memorize 9 letters, 9 in a row, it's harder than having things broken up. And so little bits about how how the brain learns. There are different styles of encoding information, different styles of learning and memorization. One of the ways I've seen, which is very ineffective, there's ample research, I've watched students do this, they just repeat this thing again and again. I'm trying to remember something, let me say it together 20 times and hope that my brain makes the link. And that's called phonological repetition. I say the thing, then say the thing. I say it again, say it again. That's called shallow encoding. You're not really getting very deep, and you're repeating, and it's very inefficient and generally very ineffective. A deeper way to encode information is, actually chains of understanding, chains of connection, chains of linking them together in meaning, not just repeating them together in a sequence. Finding a way to structure things where you link them together. Visual encoding is always phenomenal. It's always more powerful if I can find a way to link things in a visual way. The visual cortex accounts for about 1/3 of the brain mass of the cortex. And so the auditory, other parts of the brain are much less, 4% for auditory, but the visual encoding, our brain has developed so many, connections, so much energy is dedicated towards vision. So whenever I can link things, show things, make a visual representation, visual diagram, that links deeper in memory. Mnemonics are also more helpful. I still remember things, many of you do as well, like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, things that are 38 years old in your brain, they stick. Things like homes, like Huron, Ontario, Michigan, your spirit, things that stick because they're linked together. Mnemonics are memory devices. And there are many ways of doing memory devices. There are, little songs and jingles. I did some of that when I was learning. I would tie things to make it into a song or a poem, and then that would stick a lot better. And then other things, the acrostics, self-testing, making sure you actually know something is way better than repeating it 80 times. It's seeing one half of it, closing the answer. Do I actually know it? Can I retrieve it? If so, that's better than me saying those things together 8 times, because you have to be creating errors. And testing is also forced retrieval of information. It can be a flashcard, it can be Quizlet, it can be split notes. All these things are very helpful for me pulling out and saying, do I actually know this material? All right, next slide, John. One of the things we talked last week about Ebbinghaus, Hermann Ebbinghaus, very, very important researcher in psychology, just a layman who started to get curious about his own brain, his own learning, and he was learning for years. He was pairing and learning nonsense syllables together. And he was curious, if I do these 30 pairs of nonsense syllables and la and ka, and I go through them, and then I come back, do I know them in a day? Do I know them in 3 days, in 5 days, in a week? How long do these nonsense things I've linked together stick? And what he found is that memory decays pretty quickly. Within 20 days, it's down to 1 in 5, or almost worse than chance at some point. So he learned, though, if I see these pairs of nonsense syllables, review them the next day, they last a lot longer. I come back in 2 more days, I review on day 4. Then the curve really flattens, because every time I'm re-exposed to new material and I practice them and I rehearse them, I'm telling my brain, hey, this matters. It mattered Monday. It matters again too. Hey, you know what? It still matters Thursday. And the brain's looking for cues. Oh, I keep seeing this. This must be important. I should probably, make the synaptic connection stronger. So next time there's the activation of that chain, it's more efficient because this must be important to me. So the brain's trying to figure out what's important, what's meaningful. And because the brain was designed to forget. If we didn't forget, we'd be in serious trouble because we are exposed to so many stimuli that are just meaningless and unimportant. What you had for breakfast 18 days ago, who knows? XYZ. But when something, is really meaningful, you keep showing up on a recurring basis, you're like, oh, okay, this is actually, I should dedicate more resources and make this more efficient, this connection. So the brain is trying to figure out what to forget, what to remember. When you give it 3 or 4 or 5 different moments of encoding and learning, it says, this is real, I'll keep this for longer. All right, next up. However, there's also a important finding of how the brain works, that the brain does wear down over time. If we did, we have a 1-hour webinar. If we had a 4-hour webinar, I guarantee what you would retain would be, maybe you'll retain 30% of this, which is great. The parts that are more salient, meaningful to you. If we have for 4 hours, you might retain 15%, 20%, because the brain wears out. Those neurotransmitters, you have those little synaptic clefts, and you have to have things going back and forth. They start to get tired. Cognitively, the brain needs glucose. That gets depleted and diminished. And over time, if we the longer we go, the more inefficient the brain gets. So that's something. However, when you change topics, because things that we learn start eventually squeezing out things we learned before. It's called interference, and it's very well documented. However, we know that when I change topics, let's say I go for an hour talking about memory and talking about testing, and then I shift gears hard, and the next hour I talk about, let's say, something like totally different. I talk about some scientific concept. We go to astronomy, and we talk for an hour about black holes and things. Then we shift the next hour and talk about something in geopolitics. The odds of you remembering, if it was 15% of 4 hours of this content, you're going to pop up to, it could be again 25, 30% again. You become more efficient because you're using different parts of the brain, which aren't yet as tired. And when you change topics, it's kind of going to a fresh part. Oh, now we're doing math. Now we're doing science. Now it's activating different things, different connections, and so forth. So shifting around is great. And also, whenever you stop and change, there's a beginning and an end. And we have a lot of research that the brain is really good at remembering what comes first in a session. So maybe you'll remember me and John talking about Seinfeld at the very beginning. And whatever we close with, you'll probably have a better chance of remembering. Some of the middle will get forgotten, but the brain looks for primacy, what's first, and see what's the most recent. So whenever you shift and change gears, you make a new beginning and a new end. So when you're trying to learn content and material, it's really helpful to have more beginnings and more ends and change things up to have breaks. It's better for you to go an hour, take a break, come back an hour, then go for 3 hours straight, because you're making the brain less and less effective at learning and memorization. All right, next up. All right, so we talk about the importance of testing and self-testing and retrieval practice. And this is just kind of a review that not only, could I go through the last questions in a chapter, could I make my own questions for myself? Could I use flashcards, which are amazingly effective? They're very simple. A lot of my kids use Quizlet. Oftentimes there's someone else who's designed a Quizlet for their chapter, where there could be 5 Quizlets by kids in California or kids in wherever, and to help you review for this test for physics or bio or this chapter in this book. So Quizlet is great. Flashcards are great. Quizzing yourself, having someone else ask you questions. And then self-explanation is reasonably effective, where let me walk through all the phases of meiosis. Let me forcibly pull it from memory, and unaided recall retrieval is really helpful, walking things through. All right, next up. And so other strategies for rehearsing, getting ready for a test. You make study guides. Again, it's not just I'm repeating things or reading it again passively. I'm generating, I'm creating. And the act of creating and using visual and using structure, the brain likes structure. When I take information that's all just in a paragraph form and I put it in a structured linear form, the brain holds it better. When it's in, a chart, a template, these things, the brain is better at spatial organization and things, structured like that. That was a researcher I was listening to a podcast last week about that. It was pretty compelling. Other things you can do, writing down an outline, the important things. Again, you're making yourself write things down, not just passively, but I'm making decisions. This is important. It's the hierarchy. I'm listing topics I might see on the test, pros and cons. I'm looking for themes, but I'm writing, I'm generating, I'm asking questions. I'm not just passively doing anything. That's key. All right, next up, John. And we've talked about the way the brain functions and works for memory and for fatigue and for diminishing returns. And there's a lot of research on, is it better to do big blocks in a row of 3 hours of chemistry, 3 of bio, 3 of physics on exam week, or an hour change, an hour change? And by now you should know the answer. And here's the research that immediately after 3 hours of reviewing bio, people who are blocking it are pretty efficient. They actually are retaining, a good bit during that session. They've seen it a bunch of times. And the people who are mixing it up every 3 hours to come back to it aren't as good. You wait a week, give them the same assessment, same form. The kids who mixed it up and did an hour and they saw the material 3 times, not one long block, end up doing a ton better than the ones who had big blocks. Because on a big block, again, it's seeing it in multiple rounds, keeps telling the brain, this matters. This still matters. This still matters. And each one of those times, you're this, stronger synapses, more durable memories. All right, next up. All right, and then motivation. Motivation is meaningful whenever working with kids. Part of it is, what do you want to achieve on this class, on this exam? Like, what is your goal? And I always want people to have a specific and measurable goal. Whatever it is, if my goal is I want to get a 92, or my last quiz was a 83. Today's, I want to hit an 88. Whatever it is, I would take it, I want to write it down and focus on that. And then part of it's, how many can I miss? What's the structure of the test? Understanding the format of the test to help me, think out and plan. If I can only miss 4 questions, I got to make sure that I'm, really careful, really thoughtful in the beginning, and no careless errors, X, Y, Z. And we're focused on achieving this goal. You can declare that, and you can calibrate your progress. If I can only miss, 12 points out of 100 to get my 88, let me do a practice test and see, am I tracking towards that? So being very specific and very intentional is really important with that, having a goal for every assessment you take. All right, next up. And then finally, patterns. Some students, they come and say, historically, I've had a harder time on tests. And, we go back and, they're not lying. That typically, if their average is like an 87, 88 before the, the finals, typically they end up with an 85, 83, 84, and they tend to do lower. So we look at that, we factor that in terms of how much preparation to do, having that, and also, can we prepare more effectively in a different way? Should I modify, the duration, the format of preparation? And some people, they go in there and they're overconfident. They think they really have it, and then things really fall apart. And so let's look at that level of confidence. Where's it coming from? How are you calibrating? I feel ready. And what is your evidence? And sometimes it's, let's modify, even if you feel here, let's assume there's some bias in the system. There's a little bit of noise here. So let's bring that, let's correct for that and make sure you feel prepared here. Let's get you prepared to here. If typically you tend to, drop a little bit. And then be willing to shift and have a new pattern. If someone's committed to, I always do bad in exams, I have to, be willing to be open, have things change. That's part of growth and part of life, versus I'm committed to doing bad, and which is not a helpful or adaptive belief. All right, next up. All right, and then doing preparation. We have to talk about getting ready. And one part of getting ready is task initiation, which is starting. And then there's follow through, and then task completion. So there's task maintenance. And some people just put it off, and they don't begin. And then it takes hours. They do everything else but the thing that's really, essential. Other people will start, and then the first thing, they'll drop down to a lower cognitive task, because, oh, this is hard. Studying is challenging. My brain doesn't like this. It's trying to find an easier, a path of lower effort. And then in which case is my environment structured in a way that I have distractions in front of me, to the side of me, that my brain is looking for a way out. I'm going to gnaw my leg off and run away. Is my phone right here? Is my website, is my video game ready to play and queued up? And if it is, it's just so much more challenging. And part of it is managing your environment to make yourself focus, not relying upon willpower, which always breaks over time, but relying upon the strength of a well-designed, well-engineered environment. Makes you more effective, makes you more efficient. And also knowing that breaks are important, and so forth. Other thing is doing self-rewards of consequencing. If you love playing a certain video game, make yourself earn the time to do it. Not, I don't want to do this math, let me do a video game. No. If I finish the first 20 questions, then I'll have a 20-minute break doing this game. Self-consequencing, very important. And or my phone is here, I'm getting pinged on on Snapchat and Instagram. And only, if I don't get things going in 20 minutes, I'm putting the phone in the kitchen and charging it. And so, it's so self-consequencing is very important for motivation and for follow through. And also procrastination, like don't save what's really hard for the end, because oftentimes you may be poorly calibrated of how much time you need for that really hard thing. And then by the end, like, cognitive decline is real. You get tired. So do the hard thing, the hard cognitive thing on the front end, and say what's easier, what's more rote, what's more, repetitive, less thoughtful towards the end. Okay, next slide, please. John, you are up, my friend.
All right. Hey, everybody. So let's go a little more detail into the world of test day strategies and talk about, well, what are actual things that we can be doing on the day of the test to help make sure, on the day of the test and planning ahead for the test, so that we can be on our best game for it. So one of the first things I always talk to students about is like, what is actually on this test? What's expected of you on this test? Both in terms of content and also the layout of the test is going to be important, right? And so when I'm sitting down with a student and we're looking at their teachers and we're looking at teachers that they're comfortable with, and we're looking at classes they're comfortable with, and we're looking at teachers they're not comfortable with and they're struggling with, often what we're trying to do is figure out, well, what's the teacher's strategy? Well, how are they getting this material to you? And is this material being receptive in the way that we want it to? So we review their notes, we review how they take their notes, we review how the teachers provide information to the class. There's this one class I took when I was in grad school, and some of the undergrad students were in the class, and the first test came back. It was easy, but a bunch of undergrads came up to me after the test, and they're like, "We all failed that. How did you study for this test? Because you got an A on it." And I said, "Well, the professor only writes 3 words on the board every session. I don't know if you've noticed that or anything yet, but those words are important. Are you writing down those words and figuring out what they mean and really studying those concepts that he's writing down? Because that's him saying, this is stuff I care about," right? If we've got another professor who's writing everything on the board constantly, right? And so, that's good too, but that's a different world of like, these are the 3 things that matter. Can we recognize what matters to the professor and be able to give back the information that we need in that capacity, right? So we're thinking about, how do we study differently for different classes and what those expectations are? And the thing that I stress to students first before anything else is, whenever they start talking about a class where they're struggling, I ask, have you sat down and talked with that teacher one-on-one? Have you gone to their study halls, or have you gone after class to go talk to them? Because I've never met a teacher who doesn't want a kid to be successful if the kid's going to try, right? So going to that teacher and saying, I want to be better in your class. Here's what I've been doing in the past. What do you recommend that I do differently? The teacher's going to help. The teacher's going to be excited that you want to become better. And so they're going to sit there and provide you with some strategies. They're going to give you some recommendations. Now, don't do that like the last couple of days of the year, right? Do that early on when you're starting to recognize this is a struggle for you, because then you can put the energy in the right time in the right successful way. Other things you can do is talking to your classmates who are successful, right? Figuring out what are they doing to be prepared for it. So like the story I just told, talking to people who already taken that teacher, already taken that class, and asking for some strategies of what they did to be successful there. And then, like I said, show up to those study halls, show up to those review sessions, because at the very least, what you're doing is you're saying, this matters to me. I want to be here and I want to learn better, right? Which again, the teacher is going to hear. Next up, in studying for tests, you need to know, what does the test actually look like? What's going on there? What should I be studying for? Because studying for a multiple choice test is very different from studying for an essay test. And so we need to be prepared ahead of time for what they're expecting from me. So knowing the layout of the test and practicing studying the space of the test. So how you're going to study for a multiple choice test is also different from an essay test, right? For an essay test, I'm going to be thinking big picture about like, what's the potential topics, and then what are the things that I'm going to be caring about in those topics, right? Whereas multiple choice tests, I'm going to study more factually based information. I've got to memorize some stuff. How many questions are we dealing with? What types of questions? How long is this test? Is it the whole class period? Am I allowed to move from one section to another, or do I have to finish up one section before I can move to another? What's the range and depth of information that we're dealing with? Is it cumulative? Does like previous tests matter on this, or is it just what the focus of the last unit was? How's it going to be scored? Is there partial credit? How important is this test to your overall grade is a really important question as well. Because one of the things that I like to sit down and help students think about is like, you have more than one thing coming up this week that's important for you. how much priority do you put towards each of those things? If you don't have enough time to get through it all, what matters more? And so learning, hey, this test is important, but I already have an A on this class and I'm going to do pretty well on this test no matter what. Whereas this other test is also important, but I don't like that class, so I don't really want to study for it, but I'm also not doing well in that class. Well, the energy needs to go towards the other test much more than it needs to go towards this test, right? Because you can let this test slide and not do as well on this test and maybe get an 80 instead of a 90. And it will still won't hurt your grade where you are with that class. Whereas the other one, you're failing that class. So that has to take priority, and we have to figure out how to study better for that. Right. So making decisions, and sort of like what Joe was talking about a few minutes ago, you're by nature not wanting to work on the stuff that's harder. And so making a decision to put that first and foremost towards the stuff that's harder. And then also what's allowed during the test. Are you allowed to bring in your notes? Are you allowed to bring an open book? Are you allowed to bring in a calculator? What's available to us? And in the world where some tests are virtual nowadays, right? How is that set up for me? What are the rules that I need to make sure I follow ahead of time about that, like what's allowed on my desk, that sort of situation. So open book testing, everyone gets excited when they hear open book testing, but that's like the most stressful thing in the world, because the idea of open book testing is that every single page could potentially be useful, but that is going to be super time consuming to get through everything. And so helping students recognize that that doesn't mean you don't study for an open book test. Your job is to have the book as backup, but really what you want to do is to take all your notes, take all the book and condense it down to a couple of pages of very simple stuff that you have not learned fully yet, so that you can reference when you need. And the book's there, but you're not really going to use it because you're going to use these 3 pages or so that you're building out as your own service, your cheat sheet notes, if you will. So prepare your notes, simplify and categorize them, make sure they're structured in order so you can find things effectively, pare them down to the simplest they can be. And then your thought process of your notes are they're your backup. They're not your primary source. You're going, by the time you've done all this work to pare down your notes, you will have learned a lot of it, which is great news, right? So our hope at that point is you don't really need the notes, because you put a lot of work into organizing and memorizing and working with these ideas in a way like Jed was talking about earlier with studying. You built it into your own vocabulary, your own systems. Oh, there it goes. All right, cool. I missed the slide. There we go. So time management during the test is important as well, right? So how long are you going to be spending on each section of the test? Like, let's say you've got a test that's 30 multiple choice questions and 2 essays, and you have 1 hour of class to do it, and that's it. How long are you going to be spending on those different sections? And how do you recognize, oh, shoot, I spent 45 minutes on the 30 multiple choice questions, and now I have 15 minutes to write 2 essays. That is not a good time skill setup. That's not going to be successful. So how long does it take you to write 3-paragraph essays? Can we plan that ahead of time? And multiple choice questions are usually designed to be answered between 30 seconds and a minute. So if we've got 30 multiple choice questions, we should be spending 15 to 30 minutes on those guys, and that's it of our time period. So planning ahead, making sure that we actually are on the right pace that we need for this, right? Some tests are a lot more pace driven than others, and we need to be very conscious of where and how we're spending that time. Another thing that I think is really important that people overlook is your physical body and what's going on in your body and how that's going to be active for you to be successful in that test. So your body feels what happened to you 36 hours previously, which means that Monday night sleep is important for Wednesday morning's test in a way that we don't really think about. We usually think about Tuesday night sleep being important, right? But Monday night sleep is just as important. So if you've ever, and I'm sure no one on this call ever has, but if you've ever stayed up all night to write a paper or something, maybe back in college or something like that, and the next day you were fine, and then you crashed after that, that's because your body's catching up to you at that point, right? So thinking about that and remembering that is important. Also making sure that you've got the right food in your body, because if you don't, like, you'll again crash and burn. Sugar's great, but it really lasts 30 to 45 minutes in your body. So that's really not enough time to even get through like an hour-long test, even if you like down some Skittles right before the test or something like that. But proteins and carbs and stuff like that are really helpful because those are slow burns in your body, and they'll keep your energy level more constant as you go through something pretty heavy. All right, Mr. Jed.
Barrel. All right. So, John, next up, we're shifting to test day anxiety. And that's a real thing. About a quarter of kids experience test anxiety on a fairly regular basis. So, when it comes to the curve, the famed Yerkes-Dodson curve, over 100 years old, when looking at research of how much stress is optimal, how much stress, arousal, and it turns out you need some. And stress isn't a bad word, stress isn't a bad thing. We need some level of stress to realize, oh, this actually matters. My performance here has some consequence. It's not just, otherwise I might blow it off, not care, unless I had some intrinsic motivation that I was really interested in it. Otherwise, no, this grade has some effect on something. So that creates a little bit of stress, and that's perfect. Then your optimal performance, you make your best performance is when you have the right level of stress. Too much stress, though, when you get really worked up and you lose your focus and your concentration, you're overwhelmed, you can't remember things, that's when you are in distress. And that's when testing outcomes are less than optimal. Even if you've prepared, even if you put the work in, but you're so worked up about this, the outcome here is so critical, and that thought becomes dominant, and it's called cognitive obstruction. That squeezes out other thoughts, other things that you should be able to retrieve. And you also have a lot of a stress hormone. You have a lot of cortisol in the bloodstream, and the stress hormones are really good for activating the fight flight response. That's their job, but they're not great for cognition and higher order thinking. They're great for running, they're great for hiding, they're great for getting your body ready, but they're not great for keeping yourself in the frontal cortex and being able to do the slow burn of cognition and thinking. So that, go ahead, the next slide, John. So one of the ways that we diminish test anxiety is we think about other areas in our life that we are able to manage arousal and anxiety, because anyone who has any performance of any sort in their life has to deal with some level of performance pressure. And whether you're an athlete and you have a match coming up against a competitor, whether you are a debater and to get up there and speak in public, whether even if you're into gaming and there's some level of pressure, if that's your esports, whatever, area of your, whether you're student government or theater or music, something where in this moment I have to deliver. And the question is, what do you do to manage yourself? How do you self-regulate arousal and these other domains? Because often kids haven't thought, like, oh, wait a minute, I actually do this thing here. Like, this is a student who was having anxiety before standardized tests, and that was a big thing for her. And so the tutor many years ago, MK, she asked, so tell me, are there other areas? What do you do like for lacrosse? You're a big varsity lacrosse player. It's big, you're one of the team captains. How do you manage the anxiety? He's like, I go for a run before every game. I get myself, warmed up, but also calmed down. He's like, bingo, that's it. So let's bring this over here, because everyone has some strategy. I kind of remember like Michael Phelps getting amped up before the Olympics. That was probably 30 years ago now, but his very serious face. And people have certain playlists, certain kind of music. People get themselves into a certain mental state. And so can you bring this over from this domain into this other domain? All right, next up, next slide. So there's research, Sean Baylock, really important thinker, writer out of Chicago. Now she's head of a private college, but she was doing research with her colleague Ramirez about how do we get people to have less anxiety, less performance anxiety, and a simple 10-minute intervention of writing about your anxiety, calling some attention to it, focusing on how it shows up for you. I get nervous, I have negative thoughts, I get sweaty palms, my heart beats faster. Writing about that for 10 minutes actually lowers those repetitive thoughts and leads to better performance. That's a very simple intervention to help you do better on test day. John, next slide. So the other piece is that anxiety, by its very nature, it's fueled by our inner messages, the things we tell ourselves, the words that are in our head are fueling our emotional response and then our behavioral response. It's the triangle of cognitions and emotions and behaviors, behavioral therapy. And so our self-talk is fundamental to levels of anxiety and behaviors of being stuck or frozen, not doing well. So the name of the game is, can we address things through the lens of our self-talk? And the answer is yes. We have to work with our inner messages, what we're telling ourselves. And that's one of the key differences. People who are, quote, good test takers are delivering very positive messages on average themselves. They miss a problem. It's like, It's one problem. I've got this. Stay focused. Stay focused. So they're telling themselves, back in there, you got this, doing great. It's only one problem. Versus the quote bad test takers, they hit a problem. They're struggling. They miss it. Like, oh God, here it comes. Now it's going to fall apart. I don't know this material. I didn't. They begin going, and their mind starts. It's like click whir. Now this tape is playing of I'm a bad test taker, and they start versus you know what? It's a problem. Speed bump back to the work at hand. And so that's one of the key differences in terms of how you face when there is frustration, when there's a challenge. The good and bad takers, it's their self-talk. So part of our work is helping people shift and become very conscious and mindful of your self-talk. There's a great book I have on my shelf, Ethan Cross. It's called Chatter, Chatter, and Cross is up in Michigan doing research, psychologist, and ultimately he's found that self-talk is incredibly powerful and important for performance, academics, everything else. And so helping kids shift to, you know what, it's only one problem. I've got this. I prepped for this thing. It's all right. And if I begin starting this rabbit hole of, oh God, if I don't do well in this test, I'm not going to do well in this thing. And then college, and then XYZ, this whole cascade of irrelevant off-task thoughts. And we got to get ourselves back to my task at hand. What's next? Okay, whatever it is, what's next? And so part of it is the inner messaging and practicing. And while you're preparing for the test, I want you to begin to prepare your mind some for when you miss a problem, and even rehearse it, called cognitive rehearsal. It's preparation. Imagine yourself vividly missing a problem. How do you feel in your body? What do you tell yourself? And practice laying down a new pathway of, it's one problem, I've got this, I'm all right, back we go. So, but again, it's rehearsing, it's practicing what you want to happen in the stress condition when you aren't stressed. You have to rehearse this. That's part of when you're working with a therapist. You practice like when you're afraid of something in phobic reduction. I'm in a controlled setting. The phobia is not activated, but I'm imagining I'm, working through what if I did see the spider XYZ before you actually go to the zoo and see the spider. So the practicing thing is really powerful. You're trying to deal with anxiety and phobia and so forth. All right, next slide, John. All right, and now Ethan, one of his many findings. He has several dozen in his book, looking at the power of self-talk. And one of the things he found, when you create a little bit of cognitive distance and separation from yourself, from your feelings, it becomes more powerful at self-regulation and self-calming. So when I'm starting to get worked up, it's like, oh geez, I'm scared. And then part of it, you bring in the voice of wisdom. And the voice of wisdom, it's more powerful, more effective at grounding you when you're a little bit worked up by saying, John Cadenhead, you've got this. Tell yourself, like, Jennifer, slow down, you're okay. And shift to the third and second person, you've got this. Not, I'm okay, I can do it. It's, you've got this. And there's something that's more calming about hearing someone say, you've got this. It seems a little bit more external. Maybe we believe it a little bit more when we hear you've got this versus I've got this, for most people. So a little tiny shift. And so taking a test, say, Jed, you've got this, you prepared, stay focused, you missed a problem, stay in the game, you've got this. Tiny little thing there. All right, next up. One other way of managing anxiety, if it shows up for you, is to name the beast of anxiety. It's not just, I have these thoughts, like giving it an actual embodied, experience and name as, oh, that's Murray, my worry monster. That's just my critic. That's the one that's her job. That's his job. That's why he or she is here. And so part of it, when that part shows up, it's not, oh gosh, I'm falling down. It's, oh, there you are again. Well, of course you're there again, telling me you're going to fail. You're not going to do good. You always fail. You always go like, thanks. And so, but again, you're making separation. It's that cognitive distancing is a way to stay in your center. And it's powerful. It takes away some of the power from those thoughts by giving that distance. So that's a powerful thing. I've had students of mine draw a little anxiety monster or give it a name. So when it shows up, oh, there you are. And even imagining, I'm going to put you on an island for a little while. I'm going to put you, I know this is your job. But right now, I'm going to have you go over to Club Med and hang out for a little bit with a Mai Tai. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so during a test, your mind matters, your focus matters. Off-task thoughts and behaviors are going to take away from your time to work the problems. So you want to make sure that you're in the best centered, focused mindset. There have been kids of ours who are distracted by they hear a noise, or someone's crumpling a paper, or someone sneezed, or am I going to get COVID or whatever? There's some distraction. Your brain starts getting off this task, and start scanning for other things. The brain, we're always scanning for threats and things. So if you don't feel safe, it's hard to focus on anything. And so if there's thoughts of danger at any place at home, it's hard to, focus here. But apart from, actual real threats out there, many things your mind is skittering about sometimes. And the question is, how do I get in this space where I begin to keep out foreign thoughts? I've even, between, I've seen during an SAT or ACT, when there are kids go to the bathroom or kids are talking during the break, and someone else comes and they're all upset or not doing well. And part of it, how do I keep that energy out of my energy field? How do I keep those messages, those thoughts away if they're not helpful, not serving me? And I like having students, if they can, imagine like they're in a bubble. It's a simple, cognitive reframe, little mental exercise, imagining you're in this space, this kind of protected space, and doing this, when you're preparing for a test, imagine you're going to be in this, nice contained space where it's focused, it's calm, it's centered. Outside stuff stays on the outside. I'm here, I'm centered. And using a little bit of visualization, a little imagery. Your breath is incredibly powerful. We have ample evidence and research and thousands of years of using the breath to calm oneself. But now we pop people in fMRI machines and we see what happens with their brain and with their whole body when they're doing slow breathing, and it kind of taking blood samples and looking at cortisol levels and other things. Slow breathing gets you back centered, and teaching kids how to slow breathe during a test. How to, after you miss a problem, put your pencil down, let's do a couple of slow breaths, back to center. Sometimes students, can bring in an object they can hold in their hand to help them center themselves, their energy. I used to bring in crystals before big talks. I can just hold in my pocket. People have little things or rosaries or, little things that can help you kind of get centered. And then understanding that some degree of stress is actually good. And we need a little bit of stress, a little bit of arousal, a little bit of cortisol, a little bit of, epinephrine. We need that helps us actually focus and attend. If we have no concern, no cares in the world, then ultimately we're probably not going to hit our very best outcome. We need a little bit of sense of this matters. And some of your neurochemistry changing helps you focus and helps you zone in during that moment. When you're in the zone, there is a little bit of stress, but it's, it's not, again, you're on the nice part of the curve, not the bad part of the curve. All right, next up, John. You're up.
There's my mute button. Yeah. All right. So wrapping up, we got a little bit left, guys. We're going to talk through different problem types and how to think ahead for them. Right. So let's go through a couple of different types. So the first is fill in the blanks. So we're thinking about, we've got a sentence, there's a blank in there of some sort. We got to go in there and figure out what goes into that blank. For these kind of problems, a lot of what the teacher is looking for is something very specific. The teacher wants a specific word normally in that blank, or maybe a phrase or something like that. That's a common way to think about it. And so don't approach these thinking, I can put something pretty similar. I can put just something vague into those answers. That's where you're studying for some specific keywords, right? And so flashcards and stuff for fill in the blanks is going to be a very handy strategy. In terms of short answer questions, usually short answer questions have more than one part. And most of the time, teachers are either looking for, hey, you can put some bullet points of what the answers are, or just give me a couple of sentences, but we're looking for probably a paragraph or so. Make sure you're answering the question and not adding extra information. So I've definitely seen in the past when I used to be a teacher that students would, they wouldn't remember exactly what the answer was that they needed for that short answer. So they go sort of a little tangentially with their point, trying to get something in there. But the question is going to ask for something very specific. Make sure you're answering the question. If it asks for 3 examples of something, don't give a dozen, just give the 3 you need, move on with your life. Unless the teacher says, maybe you get extra credit if you can list more than 3, right? Then you have some motivation to do it. But pick the best 3, move on to the next question. Don't overwork yourself. Multiple choice questions are probably the most common thing you'll see. They're easy to grade, so we love them. Remember that the answer is right in front of you, but it may not be readily apparent. And so one of the useful strategies for multiple choice questions is, instead of trying to find the answer you like, look for what's wrong with other answers. Look for things you don't like in other answers and see if you can toss them out. So narrow down your scope of what options that you have. That way you can sort of justify answers in an easier context in that way. Don't be afraid to be critical when judging. So like we just said there, one of my favorite elimination strategies is focusing on what I don't like in answers, trying to get rid of things by saying, oh, that word doesn't make any sense contextually, so let's take that answer out. I think that can be really handy in terms of trying to narrow down your scope. If you're looking at an answer and you don't know a word or a term in one answer, but you know all the other answers are wrong, hey, choose that answer. It's okay. Don't be afraid just because you don't know that word. If you don't know a couple of words, then we got a different strategy, right? Where you need to do your best at a guess and move on with your life and not over stress it, especially if you're under time pressure. Why is it not going to the next slide? There we go. In terms of math and science, specifically thinking about what's the toolkit that I have available to me in terms of actual calculators and stuff like that. What can I bring to the table in that capacity? But also, what can I bring to the table in terms of formulas? What am I expecting to know? What formulas should I know? But also, good other questions are, what am I trying to find when I look at a new problem? What tools do I have to find that thing? What do I currently know? What do I wish I knew? How do I figure that out? Those are great questions to ask in both math and science sort of mentalities of like, there's a math problem, you got to work your way through it. Well, what do I know? Where do I need to be? And what are the steps that get me there? Same sort of for a lot of math or a lot of science. And then the other thing is put more on that paper. Like Jed just talked about, when we are anxious, when we're stressed about something, our working memory is not going to work as well. And so being able to keep all that stuff in our head that we can do in a comfortable place isn't going to go as well. The more we can put on the paper, the less we're carrying in our head and the safer we're going to be at the end of the day. In terms of writing essays, I know students hear this all the time, but brainstorming is key and organization is key. You can't just start writing and hope that it all figures itself out as you go. You need to take a couple of minutes to figure out, well, what are my main points, especially with a multi-paragraph, like a 5-paragraph essay or something like that, right? We got to figure out what are our 3 body paragraphs going to be about? What are our focus points of them? In which order should we hit? Right, making sure that we get everything we need. My biggest recommendation for organization is I like to hit my strongest point first, especially if I'm worried about time at all. Because if I am rushed for time and I have to drop a paragraph, I would rather drop the worst paragraph that I have over the best paragraph that I have. So planning ahead and sort of thinking in that capacity is important too. Writing, unless we're writing 1 paragraph, right? Then most of the time we're doing 3 distinct parts. We have our introduction, which is going to get our thesis statement in there. We've got our body paragraphs, which usually 3 is a pretty common theme for that. And we have a conclusion or restating our thesis, moving forward with it. And if you can get to the world where you have time for review, that's great. I'll tell you right now, teachers aren't going to expect you to just fully erase everything perfectly, but striking things out on a, writing in class paper is a totally fine thing to do. Right. Or like putting a little caret and putting your little extra notes or sentences or words in where you need, because they're recognizing this is work in progress that you're writing. It's not a perfect final written paper. Other sort of forms of assessment we'll run into long-term projects. Man, those are hard because they look so far away. If I said right now, I've got a project November 1st, man, that feels like forever from now, but that is a month. That is literally a month away. So what is coming up on my schedule is getting in the way of me being able to complete that. Oh man, I've got a lot of football games right around the corner, and that's going to eat football practice, and football games are going to eat up a lot of my time, right? I need to plan ahead to make sure that I've got each of the steps of this project, right? So the best thing we can do is to go ahead and block out when we're going to be working on each step of the project, right? If it involves going to the library or something like that, when am I putting that into my schedule, planning ahead? When am I getting a draft done that then I can walk away from for a couple of days and come back and read, and all those pieces of the puzzle? And then writing papers, same sort of plan, right? Thinking about, well, when's my outline going to be due? When's my first draft going to be done? A lot of teachers are helpful in terms of asking for those things, but also just setting goals for yourself with that is a great idea. And also, it's a great idea to get your paper done early, get a draft of your paper done early that you feel comfortable bringing to your teacher, and then asking your teacher, hey, can I share my draft with you and get some feedback? Again, this is the case where A, teachers are going to love that, and B, they're going to see that you're invested and you care and you want to do better. So planning ahead for that opportunity. Now, the night before the paper is due, they're probably not going to want to read it and give you feedback. So thinking about like maybe a week before it's due, can I, ahead of time ask my teacher if that's cool, and then bring it to them to get them to read it. Presentations, same sort of thought process, right? We need to plan ahead, practicing it because it's public speaking, and that's everyone's favorite thing to do. Asking for feedback from people that you practice it with, figuring out what visual aids you're going to have, like this beautiful picture we have right here. I love that one. And then making sure you can pace it correctly, right? So it is like, for example, right now on the East Coast, it's 8:51. We're wrapping up our presentation. We paced it pretty well, I feel like, into the day, because here we go. We did it. So welcome back, Jed. You want to finish this up?
It's like Festivus for the rest of us, John. Yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, so again, the things we do, academic work, we work with EF coaching, helping kids organize their thoughts, their time, their planning, and test prep. We have a quick little poll. Albert, if you would kick it off for us. It's all of 18 seconds, y'all. Are you a student, a parent, an educator? And then if you are or have, like, where are you? Are you in high school, senior, junior, sophomore, freshman? Are you in middle school, elementary? Who, getting to our audience tonight. Then the final two questions. Do you need any support with anything academic, tutoring, EF coaching, test preparation, or finally, would you want someone to reach out? Yes or no? And that's it. That's our poll, super fast. And then we're going to shift. We have two things, calls to action, things that are coming up in the next couple of weeks. We have happening right now and next week and the week after at PSAT Prep Rally. Anyone who's currently a sophomore or a junior who wants, some work, some free sessions for practice testing on the PSAT, we're offering that right now, applerouth.com/prep rally. And next, the last piece is we are at the end of our big sale for academic tutoring. If you sign up the next couple days and by Friday or Saturday, you have $100 off of any preparation you do. So if you need help with calculus or physics or chemistry or executive functioning coaching, $100 off. Applerouth.com/academic sale. All right, next up, let's go to our questions and answers. So I'm going to turn to you, audience. Take a minute, the Q&A window, and what are things you are curious about from our presentation, things you're grappling with, struggling with testing, or your child, your son or daughter. I've noticed this, seen this. See if it can be a resource to y'all. So take a minute, write your questions down, and we like questions. Not there's anything wrong with having no questions, but here we go. Can you send the slides? Sure. Oh, actually, we're going to send the recording. I think we're doing a thing now where we used to send the full deck, and now we send the recording. So that's been a shift at the company level. Other questions? And there may be no questions, and that's all right too. So, all right. Well, if nothing else is coming in, I guess we'll say thank you all very much for coming out tonight. We hope you learned something to share, something to use and try. If you need any support in any way academically, Applerouth is here, doing this work for 21 years, working with tens of thousands of kids like you. So everybody have a great night and look forward to our next talk. All right, take care.
Thank you guys so much.